And we think we are able to be born today and to live in no myth, without history. That is a disease. That's absolutely abnormal, because man is not born every day. He's once born in a specific historical setting with the specific historical qualities, and therefore he is only complete when he has a relation to these things. It's just as if you were born without eyes and ears, when you are growing up with no connection with the past. From the standpoint of natural science, you need no connection with the past. You can wipe it out. And that is a mutilation of the human being.
So let's get down to business on the history of the idea of the unconscious. It's going to be quite informative. For instance, we do have to consider where this idea of the unconscious comes from. We think of the idea of the unconscious as a psychological term. So the first step is actually, where does psychology come from, right? And the difference between psychology and psychiatry. Because in understanding the history, the first thing we have to understand is that psychiatry is very old, back to the first writings, and we have documents in ancient Greece going back to Hippocrates, and in Galen, in Roman times, doctors, medicines, talking about diseases and illnesses, and you'll find descriptions there of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and depression, all the way back, carried through a medical tradition to the present day. Psychiatry. Psychology, on the other hand, actually began in philosophy. For the longest time, the aspects of human nature and thinking about human nature were in philosophy, combined with theology, as in Christian theology in the West for a long time, but in the philosophical tradition. So we're looking for that moment when psychology moves from philosophy to its own thing. And actually, the idea of the unconscious begins to be that pivot, or the basis for the pivot. In other words, the very first time there's the use of the term the unconscious is in the year 1800 with a German philosopher called Friedrich Schelling. Schelling wrote a book called The System of Transcendental Idealism in 1800, in which he, for the first time, used the term Unbewusstsein. We have to say it in German because the unconscious comes initially in German. So what does that mean? We have Bewusstsein, meaning consciousness, and Unbewusstsein, meaning the unconscious. Now, Schelling is obviously writing this book on transcendental idealism. And what does that mean? Another German philosophy, which takes us immediately back to Immanuel Kant. Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. And Schelling is coming out of the Kantian tradition. We may need to talk later about Kant, because that becomes a stream of psychology, especially in Carl Jung, who is steeped in Immanuel Kant. For now, the main thing we have to know about transcendental idealism, which begins with Kant, is a book that Kant wrote called The Critique of Pure Reason. He wrote it in 1781, and then it was revised in 1787. Critique of Pure Reason. The most important thing for psychology that comes out of Kant is his distinction between two things, right? Things as they are, which in German means Ding an sich, the thing in itself, versus the world of appearances, or phenomenon. So this is also the beginning of phenomenology. The way in which things present themselves is always through a filter. That's the world of appearances. The filter always gives a dim impression of what is behind the filter, what is behind the world of appearances, and that is things in themselves. Ding an sich. Psychology has never escaped this particular problem. And that is the foundation of the word, the unconscious. Now, another way to think about unconscious, which we're going to do the deep dive here, and just stay with me while we do the concepts and the etymology of various words, because they're descriptive, right? We have to ask ourselves, did no one have the idea of the unconscious before the year 1800 in German philosophy? Did no one even think that there was something behind the human awareness that is unseen, that is hidden? And the answer is, of course, it existed before it acquired the name das Unbewusstsein, the unconscious. In other words, before there was the philosophical concept of the unconscious, obviously, there was sort of the human experience of the unconscious. And now we're getting back to sort of a primary psychological experience. That's the way I like to think about it. People were aware that there was a distinction between being conscious and unconscious long before 1800. Another way to come at this is with a word game. I like word games. Maybe you like word games. And it's with these pairs of opposites that we can think about the ancient distinction between the conscious and the unconscious. So here are four pairs of words that I want you to think about, and then we'll work on the etymologies. Sleep versus wake. That kind of unconscious experience. Sleep versus wake. Forget versus to remember. Ignorance versus knowledge. And surprisingly, the root words for dead versus alive, which is really deadness versus aliveness. A very visceral, ancient perception of that quality of aliveness, which is force or movement or animation, and then that quality of deadness in which there is no force, no movement, no aliveness. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's start with the first word pair, right? Sleep versus wake. So we know the word in Greek already as it comes into psychology. The Greek word for sleep is hypnos. There's several words in Greek that mean to awake, but the word that applies most in this situation is exhypnizo. Hypnos to sleep, exhypnizo to awake. We get the same kind of contrast in Latin, where the word you know, of course, for sleep is somnum, as in insomnia. And the Latin word, or again, one Latin word for waking is evigilatonian. Evigilatonian. And of course, from that Latin root, we get our word vigil, vigilance, and really the word vigor is in evigilatonium, to wake. Two states, sleeping and waking. And the comparison is we have to go back then behind the Latin and the Greek to the Proto-Indo-European language. And we'll be referring to that a bit because all of these words, Greek, Latin, German, making its way into English, have a common root. In other words, Proto-Indo-European, Indo means India. And in this case, it means Sanskrit. So there's a root word in Sanskrit called veg, W-E-G, which means force or strength of something, veg, W-E-G. The way that language works, veg, that root comes into German as wachen, and of course translates to English as to wake. That implies two states, right? Conscious and unconscious, wake and sleep. Let's try another word pair. To forget and to remember. It's interesting, if we go to the Latin, it's a word that you will know. Oblivicatur, to forget. Oblivion, right? Our word, the root word oblivion means to forget, and the Latin word for to remember is very close to our English word memanio, or another form that we know it as memento, to remember. In Greek, it gets us a lot closer to what we're talking about. There's several words for forgetting in Greek, in which the most famous is lethe, because we know that from mythology as the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And from Lethe we get English words like lethargic and lethal, both in the sense of to forget. That's what lethargic means. Lethal, it's this sense of to render someone unconscious. Lethargic, lethal. That's lethe, but the other word is a word that you will know without thinking about it, because another Greek word for to forget is amnesia. Amnesia, which is thought of more as the A, as in not remembering. Amnesia. And then to remember is a more obscure word that analysts know. Anamnesis. Amnesia, anamnesis. Anamnesis means, in the psychological context, the remembering. Essentially, that's the case history. Either is told by the patient or the analyst, carefully going point by point through the patient's history. Anamnesis. This root word for memory, back in the Sanskrit, is mamnao. That's where our word is derived from, and mamnao is a form of another Sanskrit word which sort of brings this full circle, which is manas. Manas is the word that we get our word man, as in human, comes from the word manas in the Sanskrit. What does manas means? Manas means mind. So to bring to mind, or that man, humans, are a creature who have a mind. That's the sort of original sense of it, as in Homo sapiens, and we'll get to Homo sapiens in a minute as we go through the Latin. So this Sanskrit is coming from the Vedas and the Upanishads. We're talking now about 1800 BC, and an ancient culture. Already in the Vedas and Upanishads, there's an idea of two manas, two minds. So here's another word that you will know. the Sanskrit word for waking, back to waking, is bodhi, from which is derived, of course, the Buddha, meaning the awakened one, the one who is awakened. Bodhi means awake. So the two kinds of mind back in the Vedas and the Upanishads are the bodhi manas, the awakened mind, and the kama manas. Kama means emotional, of the body. The kama manas and the bodhi manas. Two minds already in 1800 BC. So now we're not talking about the discovery of the unconscious and the first use of the word in 1800. Now we're going back 3,600 years into the Vedas with the concept of two minds.